If you're just joining us, thank you for attending, and we'll get started in about 5 minutes. If you're just joining us, thanks for attending. We'll give folks a few more minutes to sign on, and then we'll get started. Thanks for being here. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the second rulemaking hearing for the proposed rules for takeoff and landing of UAS or drones in state parks and along the ocean shore. I'm joined here tonight by a couple of state park staff people. Brady and Joe, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Brady Callahan. I'm the geospatial team lead and unmanned aircraft system coordinator.
Good evening. My name is Jo Niehaus. I'm with the Government Relations and Policy Unit, and I'll be helping with the questions and comments.
And I'm Katie Gauthier. I'm the rules coordinator for the drone rule process, and I will be the hearings officer for this evening. We are here this evening to take public comment on the proposed rules. We will, we've done the welcome and introductions. We will provide a background and explanation of the proposed rules and a little bit about the next steps for rulemaking and take questions on the process or clarifications of what's in the proposed rules. And then it'll be an opportunity to provide public comment. This isn't we're not making any decisions this evening, and we won't necessarily have answers to why certain things are in the rules or how the rules would be implemented, but we are happy to answer process questions or clarifications on the proposed rules. And we would ask that you limit your comments to around 3 minutes so that everyone has an opportunity to comment, and we'll do the comments at the end. But first, I was just going to give you a little bit of information about how we got to this point in the process. We have been working on drone management for some time. Back in 2016, 2017, there was a state statute that required state agencies to develop a policy around internal use of drones and manage storage of data and management for how we would use research and data storage. And Brady was involved with that process. We had an external stakeholder group advise us on how to develop that process and have been using drones for research and some management and internal use since 2017 when that rule was, when that policy was approved. In 2018, we started to look at how we could manage visitor use and what a rule would look like. We talked to the Department of Justice, and they informed us that we could not do a administrative rule without seeking legislative approval. There was a statute that does not allow for state agencies to write administrative rules around drone use without seeking legislative approval. So we went to the legislature and developed a legislative concept, and in 2021 sought legislative approval to write a rule around drone use. We talked to the legislators about writing a rule that would allow drone use in certain areas and then limit it in other areas for the protection of natural resources and scenic and cultural resources. So Senate Bill 109 was enacted in the 2021 legislative session, and then the rulemaking process began after that. In the meantime, we have been managing drone use within state parks. They are allowed currently in parks, but there are individual parks that do prohibit the use of drones if it's endangering a natural or cultural resource, or if it's posing a risk to people or property or interfering with another recreation form. They also are prohibited on the ocean shore in snowy plover management areas during the management season. And that's all motorized and unmotorized devices are prohibited in that area. But we do lack clarity on where takeoff and landing can occur. So that is the intent of moving forward with rulemaking. It is clear that the FAA regulates airspace. We do not have authority to regulate the airspace. That's why the proposed rules only address takeoff and landing. This sign is a draft sign that the FAA has provided for local jurisdictions to designate areas where takeoff and landing is prohibited, but the airspace is jurisdiction of the FAA. And they have rules that guide commercial and recreational drone operations that are already in place. Takeoff and landing is prohibited in national parks, national monuments, designated wilderness areas, and federal wildlife refuges. So the proposed rules that we are taking public comment on, and the full copy of the rules is available on our website, but they would allow for creation of zones where takeoff and landing of drones are prohibited. And the specifically automatically prohibited zones would include overnight camping facilities, areas that are designated for protection as marine research areas, marine garden and marine education areas, and marine conservation areas in the territorial sea plan. And then just a clarification that snowy plover management areas would continue to be closed during seasonally. The prohibition zones would be designated based on visitor safety, sensitivity to natural, scenic, or cultural resources, or user conflict. And they would be posted on our website for 30 days. In the open areas, drone operators would be required to operate in a reasonable and prudent manner to the conditions. And existing wildlife laws and rules would apply. Drone operators could apply for a permit or permission to take off or land in a closed area, and public safety agencies would not need approval to fly during emergencies. If the rules are approved, then OPRD would work with park managers, neighboring land managers, and stakeholders to evaluate areas that should be closed either year-round or seasonally, and the reasoning, look at the reasonings for those. The proposed rules would be posted on our website, and we would create maps that could be posted on our website and shared with other agencies. We would also work with a number of agencies and organizations on creating education efforts around responsible drone use and helping people be informed about where drones would be allowed and getting the word out. The rulemaking, so if the rules, we're taking public comment through April 7th, and then the rules will go to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Commission at their June meeting to make a determination. So we will take the public comment and read through and review all of the comments that are received between now and the June meeting. So for tonight's hearing, it is an opportunity to provide public comment. There's no decisions that will be made at this hearing. We would provide 3 minutes to comment, and commenters are going to be called in the order that you registered. So I will call the first person and then say who the next person is, and I will move you in as a presenter so that you can comment, and you're free to turn on your video if you'd like, and we'll stop sharing the PowerPoint so you are free to be seen, or you can just do the audio if you would like to do that. And then this meeting is being recorded and posted on our website. But if you don't wish to comment, you can just say pass or type into the chat that you don't wish to comment. So at this time, are there questions about the process or clarifications on the rules? You can either raise your hand or type those into chat.
Katie, we have one question in the chat from Tim asking, do you know what percentage of state park and or beach areas included in the areas where drone takeoff is to be banned? Overnight facilities, research areas, and snowy plover habitat in season?
I don't know a percentage of land area. I think that would be a great question to put in your public comment to ask and put a reason kind of why you think it should be one amount or another amount. But I don't have an answer to that. There is a definition for overnight facility in the proposed rule, and that really is the campground part of a state park, so where people are sleeping.
David has a specific question about where you can fly, where can you fly on the beach? For example, Seaside, Cannon Beach, etc.
The specific locations have not been determined yet. Those would be determined through a process with park staff, local land managers, subject matter experts, and stakeholders that would be talk through what the needs were for closures and areas that should be protected at certain times or year round. So none of the areas have been, the only areas that have been predetermined are those specific sections that are in the territorial sea plan on the ocean shore or the campgrounds within state parks.
Here's a process question from Joseph. Why isn't there public comment to the commission at the June meeting?
Because our public comment period closes April 7th, then unless the public comment period were continued, then you cannot do public comment after the closure of the public comment period.
Paul asked, why wasn't the MRs, MPAs included as a closure areas?
Maybe somebody, I don't know, Brady, if you know what MRs and MPAs, I think that would have been a Laurel question. Or if you want to tell, and if it would be a great, the decision hasn't been made. So if you think that the MRs and MPAs should be included, please put that in the public comment. The marine reserves and protected areas. We were including territorial sea plan areas, but if you think that those are other areas that should be automatically protected, please put that in the public comment.
Jim has a question asking what specifically prompted this process. The FAA rules for UMA would have allowed state or safety uses without opening the public access issue.
We had heard from a number of both park visitors and drone operators that wanted clarity about where they could and couldn't operate. So that was the intent behind going and seeking permission to write specific rules for takeoff and landing and putting in specific areas so that we could have clarity to have people say, yes, this area and no, this area.
We have a follow-up question about the public comment process and how does the public know you incorporated their feedback? No testimony at commission.
We provide the Parks Commission with a report on the public comment that was received and any of the changes that were made based on the public comment that was received. And I think that there's a hand that was raised as well.
It looks like there was, but I think if people have questions, they can put that into the chat or the Q&A right now. And then we're calling on people when they give their public testimony.
Okay, that works. Oh, and
so Deb, if you have a question, you could type that into the chat. And then if you have comments, if you're registered for comment, you will have 3 minutes during the public comment section. More raised hands. Oh boy, I hope I don't have to read all of these out loud. So I'm not seeing a specific question in here. This looks like a commentary or a public comment or input from Deb. So I'm going to defer to her saying her comment during the public comment section. Oh, there's a question. How was this decision reached and can you make any communications between the first and second meetings public?
so the question is about there was a concern that there weren't enough conservation or there weren't conservation representatives included in the first rule advisory committee. And then they were added in the second rule advisory committee. And so I did hear from a number of individuals that we didn't have the right people at the table at the first rule advisory committee. So we did have a second rule advisory committee meeting and added members to make sure that we had a broader representation. So that's why there was a second rule advisory committee meeting. And moving forward, we do understand that it's important to hear from a number of stakeholders, land managers, subject matter experts, as we make the determination of which areas specifically are opened or closed. And the rules are a tool to go in that direction, but the specific areas will still be an ongoing iterative process.
That might be it for process questions, Katie.
Okay, well, thank you for the process questions. Before I'm going to share my screen one more time, and this is before we move to the public comment portion of the evening, I did want to make sure that if you want to submit written comments, you can do that on our website or in writing or via email. And we are taking comments through April 7th at 5 p.m. So please feel free to submit comments that way. We have been getting lots of comments, and all of the comments are posted on our website if you want to read other people's comments. So I will stop sharing this and we'll start going through and I will call through the list one by one. Let's see if we can get through. Give me just a second to get to who is there. So it looks like Patrick Chewing, you're first, and then Deb, you will be second. And we are going to ask that you try to stick to 3 minutes.
Katie, do we have a number of people giving testimony today?
We have, there are up to 23 people. So Joe, do you want to be the timer for us?
I will. Once we get to about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, I'll start waving my hand. And we'll politely interrupt at 3 minutes.
Great, thank you. So Patrick, I'm going to promote you. And as soon as you get into the room, you can start unmuting and so Patrick, if you want to unmute and
Hit unmute, thank you.
great.
So I am Pat Tuning and I'm going to share my screen. So what I want to comment about today is the way the details are done here. The devil is in the details here as far as where they're allowed and where they're not allowed. I know the maps showing allowed and prohibited areas and have not been developed yet and will be in the future. My comment is to encourage you to go slowly, only prohibiting in known problem areas. This is where the start is. These are all the state parks. They're colored blue, meaning that the drone use is allowed. That's where we are today because the rule is not implemented yet. So what I encourage us to do is to start like this. Find the few areas where your problems have been historically, or you know that there is special treatment of birds or other wildlife that need protecting, and restrict the drone takeoff and landing in just those areas while leaving the rest of the areas open for drone usage. That would be the blue state park and shoreline areas. This is what I don't want to happen, is the start here with everything closed and just a few areas open. So this is the basis of my first point I want to make, is that you go slowly and start with lots of blue and a couple red places, and only add more red as you find problems. That's the extent of my comments today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And Deb, you're in if you want to unmute and share your comment.
I'm muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just talking about recreational drone use here, not scientific or departmental. I would like to note that in the public comment entries, there was extensive support for more consideration to be paid to wildlife endangerment, as well as diminishment of enjoyment of natural areas for other recreational users when drones were present. But I'm going to be focusing on wildlife concerns. And so I've got some questions that I'm going to pose and answer. And what is at risk from drones as far as wildlife? Well, basically their lives are at risk. Disruption, harassment, endangerment, even if unintentional, of wildlife it can affect in all aspects of their lives. There have been some studies on drones impact on wildlife, but one that I thought was particularly interesting was drones as a threat to wildlife. YouTube complements science in providing evidence about their effect by Cambridge University Press. And they excluded videos where animals were deliberately targeted. So it was only included incidental contact. And they found that most of their videos of drones overflying wildlife did cause a behavioral disturbance. It did depend on habitat. So 90% of aerial habitat or birds were disturbed, which makes sense. 85% terrestrial habitat, or mainly mammals, much less so for aquatic animals, with only 20%. So when is the risk? Wildlife needs to be protected from disruption during critical times like nesting or raising young, and also when foraging, resting, migrating, etc. So in other words, pretty much all the time. And then the question is, where is the risk spatially? A lot of people talk about restricting drone use from the few areas of sensitive habitat, but that naively suggests that these areas are limited. Realistically, almost an entire area of a state park is wildlife habitat. So everywhere there is risk. And a question, can there be effective enforcement? We all know there are very few resources to police this. Drone operators, by their very essence, are often invisible and inaccessible. And the other thing about risk is that the destructive possibilities of a single drone flight can be devastating for wildlife. If the 2021 May incident where a drone crashed into the Boca Chica Ecological Reserve in California, 1,500 tern nests were abandoned. That's about 3,000 eggs were abandoned, and because of a drone, and basically a whole generation of seabirds was wiped out. And then there's the myth of a few bad actors. This YouTube study showed that many users upload videos with flashy titles alluding to attacks or collisions of wildlife with drones, particularly birds. This is kind of naturalizing this behavior and encouraging others to do so. I did a quick Google of drone or wildlife encounters, and the worst one I came up with as a result, they came up a lot of them, was animals don't like drones. These drones invade their space and get all up in their faces. Some of these animals won't just sit there and do nothing. They would get up into the drones business as well.
That'd be 3 minutes if you have any concluding remarks.
Just one more sentence. Join us as we look at some animals that are not afraid to take on these robotic trespassers of the sky. This time we will show you some of the most epic clashes between animals and drones. You're not going to believe what our number 2 did to a drone, this 2-pick did to this drone. Keep watching.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Deb, for sharing your comments. If you have any further comments, please make sure to submit them online or in writing. So next up is Heather Kelly, and then Joe Lebo site. Heather, if you want to unmute.
Hi, everyone. So I was just writing what I wanted to say. I am an FAA certified pilot. I am a pilot by trade. I have spent the last year becoming a pilot. I worked at Boeing. I've done a lot of work in aviation field. I currently fly 4 different drones, and a lot of my work is focused on wildlife and nature. And to the last presenter, I would say that I'm absolutely in agreement. Larger drones are disruptive to wildlife, and hobbyists do not have the training to be flying around not only wildlife, but also flying around humans. FAA regulations have changed this year. They just are starting to allow pilots to even fly over human beings. That was a regulation where you were unable to fly over human beings. So it seems to me that we shouldn't be flying over wildlife without the appropriate individuals in place that can ensure that wildlife is not disturbed. But a larger situation that I wanted to point out is that when you're flying on the coast, you're flying in airspace where there could be an emergency that occurs. And so I'll give an example of something that occurred to me. I wasn't flying that day. My husband and I were on the coast, we're on the Oregon coast over, I want to say Gold Beach, and a kayaker had gotten caught in the undertow and was being pulled out to sea. What unfortunately happened is that within a matter of minutes, the airspace was compromised, where there were 2 helicopters in drone airspace that were in A airspace, and there were 4 other drones in the area seeking this individual. If a hobbyist had a drone up at this time while FAA approved pilots were doing a search and rescue, that drone could have hit a helicopter, it could have hit another drone, and it could have created a very chaotic and destructive experience. And my feeling is that flying a drone is a wonderful thing to do. It's exciting, you get to see a lot, but there are rules and regulations. And with hobbyists, they don't really understand what it takes to become a regulated pilot. And I would definitely push for higher regulations around the coast just to protect the airspace as well as to protect the wildlife, but also to protect individuals who might be in safety situations.
Great, thank you, Heather. Chris, Joseph said he would rather you go first. So if you would like to unmute and go.
Thank you. My name is Chris Wold. I am a law professor at Lewis and Clark Law School. I teach ocean and coastal law, among other classes. I appreciate that OPRD has established the Drone Rules Advisory Committee to provide advice on rules for landings and takeoffs of drones on OPRD properties. However, there have been some serious improprieties with this process that may very well violate Oregon administrative law. Oregon law requires that if an agency appoints an advisory committee, it shall make good faith efforts to ensure that the committee's members represent the interests of persons likely to be affected by the rule. In light of the known impacts to wildlife from drone use, it should have been clear to OPRD that conservation interests should be included on the RAC. Indeed, OPRD testimony in support of SB 109, which authorized the RAC, stated that the RAC would include conservation advocates. Yet inexplicably, the initial RAC did not include such representatives likely to be affected by the rule, even though many are readily identifiable. Only after multiple members of the public expressed concern to OPRD did OPRD add 2 conservation representatives to the RAC for the second meeting. This was not a minor flaw in the process because important decisions were made during that first meeting. At the first meeting, OPRD started its presentation by proposing to prohibit the taking off or landing of drones unless it was expressly authorized. But during the discussion of the proposal, interests representing drone users made numerous interventions to shift the presumption to one of permitting use unless prohibited. At the RAC's second meeting, OPRD then began its presentation of the draft rules supporting a presumption of use unless expressly prohibited. The flawed RAC process continued. During the second meeting, a conservation representative proposed reversing the presumption to prohibit drone use unless permitted. Despite OPRD's initial proposal presented at the first meeting and the presence of at least 4 new RAC members at the second meeting, OPRD never mentioned its initial proposal. To the contrary, OPRD then stated that it had some kind of agreement with legislators that the rulemaking was not intended to ban drone use. I have 5 brief comments on this point. First, nothing in the legislative history supports that view. Second, nothing in SB 109 supports that view. To the contrary, SB 109 suggests a presumption against use, or taking off and landings, by indicating in paragraph 2 that the rules adopted, quote, may allow, unquote, use in certain circumstances. Third, the statement is, of course, entirely at odds with OPRD's initial proposal. As such, and fourth, the statement strikes me as a kind of post hoc rationalization for the new proposal. And fifth,
You're at 3 minutes if you can conclude. Thank you.
And fifth, the presumption against use is not a ban on drone use. It merely requires OPRD to engage in a process to identify those places that are safe for drone use, places that will not harm nesting birds and other wildlife. In conclusion, OPRD has improperly established the RAC and continued the process by failing to include conservation members from the outset. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your comments, Chris. Joe?
Thank you for providing the opportunity for public testimony tonight. My name is Joe Levizite. I'm staff scientist at Portland Audubon. I provide testimony today on behalf of our over 16,000 members statewide, as well as on behalf of many other organizations representing many thousands of Oregonians. In light of the flawed and potentially illegal drone process highlighted in the previous testimony by Chris Wald, we propose OPRD can reconcile these problems by amending the draft rules to the following, quote unquote, drones be prohibited unless otherwise indicated in designated takeoff and landing areas. This presumption has many advantages to the current draft rule, which allows use unless prohibited, as we've been talking about. First, having designated allowable areas will better safeguard wildlife, since it would improve the ability to minimize wildlife disturbances by better limiting takeoff and landing areas, and thus how far and wide drones can move when in the air, which is, of course, FAA regulated. Second, this presumption is consistent with OPRD's current regulations regarding commercial and non-traditional activities, which require special use permits in situations when such uses, quote unquote, could disturb natural, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources and or could pose a safety concern. These are noted in sections F and G of that rule. Third, it is consistent with OPRD practice in relation to other activities that may have conservation impacts. Hunting and fishing is prohibited unless permitted. Collecting and removing living or non-living natural products from the ocean shore is prohibited unless permitted. Use of slingshots and paintball guns is prohibited except as authorized at the ocean shore. Even the use of metal detectors is prohibited except in designated areas. Fourth, a presumption against drone use unless permitted is consistent with the rules of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which manages the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge. And finally, from a law enforcement perspective, it would be easier to regulate drone use in designated allowable areas. Everywhere else would be clearly illegal. State parks should create an independent technical working group. I think Katie alluded to this at the beginning, which is great, but it should be an independent technical working group, not just made up of OPRD agency folks, but also academics, NGOs, tribal experts, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, which was not invited on the rack, to determine appropriate designated drone takeoff and landing areas that minimize wildlife, cultural, and recreational impacts. While this is being done, the status quo drone usage could continue. This is why we have heard some erroneous information from the drone community that everything would be banned all at once, which is not true. All right, I just have one more thing to just say. In areas that drone rules, drones would be permitted, we do recommend some common sense things like drones takeoff landing shouldn't happen within 100 meters of any observed wildlife. And there are several other things we'll put in public comment about that. This is all based on, all these recommendations are based on evidence in the scientific literature. Thanks very much for the time.
Thank you, Joe. Tim.
Yes, I'm a professional writer and photographer with 30 books published, including 15 photo books about recreation, nature, and adventure travel, several of them about Oregon. As a photographer, I do not use a drone, but if I did, I would not use it in any situation involving our parks or beaches, or where birds or wildlife might occur, or any place where the drone might be seen or heard by other people. The reason for that is I don't want my recreational or professional activities to ruin anyone else's experience. I know not everyone agrees with this view. That's why it's imperative that the public agency entrusted with the management of our parks and beaches take responsibility for the quality of the public's experience and for the wildlife that are dependent on these habitats. Our state parks receive 54 million visitor days a year. Since I've rarely seen a drone in a state park through 20 years of living full-time in Oregon, and in visiting one of those parks almost every day, I assume that the number of people using drones in the parks is very low. Let's just consider an extremely high estimate of 1,000 people. That's less than 1 out of every 54,000 visits to the parks. If you think the numbers here are wrong, just show me what they really are. But for a minuscule minority of visitors that use drones, the department's proposal will sacrifice the rights of all the other people. Those of us that go to our parks and beaches seek the natural world for quiet, for peace, escape from the racket of places around us. And to do that, we already have to avoid the highways and traffic, the jet skis, snowmobiles, off-road vehicles, trail bikes, chainsaws, leaf blowers, and on and on. Now we have to avoid drones as well. And unlike those other obstacles interfering with a pleasant trip to the park, drones can fly anywhere, overhead, out to sea, in the treetops, up and down our rivers. The proposed rule would be like allowing four-wheel drive vehicles to go everywhere off-road. The invasion of privacy is like having a stranger follow you with a camera when you go for a walk at the beach. Why would our state parks be any different from our national parks where drones are prohibited? The only difference I see is that the managers of our national parks care about the quality of the park experience to the vast majority of their visitors and about the viability of wildlife, and they take responsibility for them, while our state park officials seemingly do not. Please prove me wrong on this issue. There are other places where people can use drones. In fact, almost everywhere else in Oregon, and state parks account for only 0.2% of the land area. Beaches don't add a whole lot to that. Why can't this tiny fraction of our natural estate be protected? Following the path of permitting drones as proposed puts us all in the endless path of fighting over parks and beaches, mile by mile, acre by acre. This question will divert park staff from the jobs they need to do and will set our communities of users up for endless conflict. Is this what you really want to take? Is this the way you really want it to be? I've been a proud—
3 minutes if you have any concluding comments.
I've been a proud defender of our parks against threats ranging from luxury golf courses to water pollution, to dams, to golf course, to gorse infestations. And the irresponsibility of this proposal makes me disappointed, disgusted, and outraged. And I know I'm not alone. If nothing else, I urge you to take action on this proposal, to not take action on this proposal, and instead that you survey the desire of park visitors, that you seek and follow the advice of professional wildlife biologists not affiliated with state parks or the drone industry, and that you hold further hearings on alternatives to this ill-advised proposal. I
Thank
urge
you.
the Parks and Recreation Department to rise to the challenge in front of you.
Great. Thank you, Tim, for your comments. If you have any further comments, please feel free to submit those in writing. Next up is Diane, if you want to unmute and share your comments.
Hi. Thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on the draft rules for drone takeoff and landings on state parks and ocean shores. I have been monitoring black oyster catchers and observing seabird colonies off the offshore rocks since 2006. From 2006 to 2011, excuse me. I have never seen any harassment of birds by drones. After this time, drone harassment became increasingly prevalent. 3 years ago, they became every few weeks I would see drone harassment. And I should say that I live in Bandon, Oregon, and so there's a huge amount of tourists on our beaches. In fact, Kathy, your picture is one of the bird nesting areas that we monitor right now. And there's actually 3 pairs of black oyster catcher nests in those areas. So last year, the disturbance rose to once a week, and in some cases, there was more than that in a day. So what happens? The black oyster catchers perceive a drone just as they would a peregrine falcon, and they chase after it. And when the drone goes really high, they'll go really high. Normally, black oyster catchers only chase up to maybe 100 feet above their nest. In the case of drones, it can be 300 to 400 feet above the sea level, which is a huge amount of energy. So in addition, I see drone harassment around nesting colonies. On July 4th, 2020, I was on top of Coquille Point looking at Elephant Rock, and all of a sudden I see all of the birds come up off of the rock, and there's a drone that's going back and forth over the top of the rock. And those birds were 50 to 100 feet, all climbing and screaming. And those birds all had nests, and some of them with chicks. There was a wide assortment of marine birds on that particular rock. So there was a major disturbance. And in our area, we have Face Rock. And I am very concerned about so many of the bird colony rocks along our coast being disturbed consistently over the oyster catch, over drone harassment. So I would strongly encourage you to change your proposed rulemaking from everything is open to drones to everything is closed except for in certain areas where takeoffs and landings can be safely done without bird harassment. And I strongly encourage that March 1st through September 30th, the critical bird nesting season be observed over any of the areas where we have nesting birds on our Oregon.
Diane, you're at 3 minutes. Do you have any concluding comments?
No, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to comment.
Thank you for being here, Diane. Derek, you're next, and then it will be Fran.
Thank you. My name is Derek Coulter. I'm testifying in support of a presumption against drone use except in designated places, as it was originally presented at the first meeting of the Rules Advisory Committee on this issue. Research continues to emerge that drone use is rapidly increasing in Oregon, including in state parks and on its beaches and rocky headlands. And it is having an adverse impacts on nesting seabirds and shorebirds. Here in Cannon Beach, we're seeing an increased drone use with so many drones flying over vulnerable nesting oyster catchers and our tufted puffins, two species identified as birds of conservation concern. In fact, the latest work by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service shows a continuation in the decline of tufted puffins at Haystack Rock, along with the entirety of the coast. The health of these species at Haystack Rock cannot endure additional disturbances. As such, I would support a presumption against the taking off and landing of drones on OPRD properties unless expressly permitted based on criteria that ensures the safety of Oregon's nesting bird species. Again, to reiterate what we heard from Joe, such a presumption is consistent with the other rules that other outdoor activities, hunting, fishing, collecting or removing living or non-living natural products from the ocean shore is prohibited unless permitted or subject to an exception. Within the ocean shores recreation area, the use of slingshots and paintball guns is also prohibited. Even metal detectors is prohibited except in designated areas. In fact, there was so this and that's an excellent model, I guess, for the drone use and that was proposed at the original meeting. The presumption is also consistent with OPRD's current regulations that require special use permits in situations when such use could, quote, could disturb natural, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources, unquote. We already know what drone use does, that it does disturb nesting birds, such as the thresholds that of could disturb is met for birds during certain times of the year, especially along the coast. Our nesting colonies are in the thousands. These are big. I mean, one drone can disturb quite a few birds, and I've personally seen many drones and talked to many drone pilots that just don't seem to respond well to asking, to give the birds some space. As a pedestrian walking with my family down the beach, it's really hard to watch. Moreover, a presumption against drone use, unless prohibited, is consistent with the rules of our neighbors, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, at many of these rocky.
3 minutes if you want to conclude.
Sure. So nevertheless, I thank you for your time, and I just think that being consistent with these rules, with with a lot of other states and how they manage the state parks and drones takeoff and landing, I think it would be good on us to show a similar approach. Thank you again for your time.
Great, thank you, Derek. Fran, I am not able to get you in, but I hit unmute, so you should be able to speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, but you can't see my video?
Correct.
That's better. My name is Fran Recht. I'm a long-term resident of Depot Bay on the coast. I'd like to testify against any drone use takeoff and landings from Oregon state parks on the shore, except when specifically authorized with a special use permit, for example, for special events and research. These use permits would be able to specify appropriate provisions to avoid natural resource and visitor disruption. Additionally, if such special use permits would be required to be visibly displayed, such as required for wilderness permits, then enforcement would be easy. I have lived on the coast for 34 years, and I observed the amount of use of our state parks steadily increasing and our parks becoming overwhelmed by visitors. Few new parks have been created in this time period to keep up with the population growth and use. My observations were recently confirmed with data on visitor use that OPRD compiled and which were reported in the Oregonian. In a February 18th article, it was reported that the numbers for 2021 showed a general return to pre-pandemic visitor numbers, and that this has been a long-term trajectory that has seen state parks getting more and more popular over the last decade. In Oregon, this was 53.7 million visitors in 2021. The Oregon coast was especially impacted by swelling crowd numbers. On the coast, 31.4 million visitors showed up, surpassing by 2 million the previous record set in 2017. In fact, concern about the usage in parks on park resources, the spokesman for parks encouraged people to use other outdoor spaces to reduce state park crowding. Simply put, there are too many people already coming to state parks to add a use that is in conflict with the very values most people report seeking out in state parks. In fact, an OPRD survey of over 10,000 Valley Region visitors between 2011 and 2014, the most popular activities were hiking and walking, 54%, sightseeing, 40%, picnicking or barbecuing, 43%, swimming, wading, 24%, and bird or wildlife watching, 17%. A similar study was done in 2019 for coastal parks, but I could not find that online. I'm sure bird and wildlife watching would be even higher in ranking on the coast due to the presence of whales, seals, and sea lions, and many nesting birds, including ones particularly sensitive to disruption, such as the colonies, common murres and cormorants, nesting black oyster catchers, iconic ones such as tufted puffins, and threatened ones such as the snowy plover or Marburg murrelet. With climate change continuing to put stress on the ocean environment, prey, and the natural resources these species depend on, any drone use that result in disruption of resources would further exacerbate the stresses. There have already been plenty of examples of drones disrupting nesting birds on the coast. OPRD's climate change strategy adopted in 2021 acknowledges that climate change is a stress multiplier that exacerbates existing political, economic, social, and environmental tensions throughout Oregon. It also says that OPRD will support robust functioning of Oregon's terrestrial, aquatic, coastal, and marine ecosystems as the climate changes. We will not be able to
if you can conclude.
We will not be able to support these systems and species without further disruption from drones. And this also conflicts with the state park's own policies about sustainability and found in the 2013 to 2017 Oregon State Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan. And I'll submit those further comments in writing. And just to conclude, drone pilots have plenty of other places they can launch and retrieve their drones without disruptions of the millions of visitors who come to the parks for other reasons and to the natural resources of these parks protect. Unless there's a special reason that a drone is necessary to be launched and retrieved within a state park, it simply shouldn't be. Special use permits would be sufficient to take care of those needs. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Fran, for being here. So next up, we have Kelly, if you want to unmute and provide.
Right. Thank you. My name is Kelly Ennis, and I'm a biologist for the city of Cannon Beach. My role here is as the director of the Haystack Rock Awareness Program. We run a free interpreter program from February through October, which coincides with our tourism season and the nesting sea and shorebird season. We have been in operation since 1985 and have the unique position of having data and eyes on a popular sea and shorebird nesting site for over 35 years now. First, I'd like to say I appreciate the attention given to the limit takeoff and landing sites for the territorial sea plan locations and the snowy plover management zones. Today, I'm asking that you expand that all recreational drones be prohibited to land and take off in any of our ocean shores unless specifically allowed and determined by committee to have minimal ecological impacts, and to include a review from a wildlife biologist in the permitting system, as well as some fines for violations. Biodiversity has been declining globally. Sea and shorebirds nest during our summer season when visitor populations are at a peak. Between climate change, rising ocean temperatures, oil spills, induced algae blooms, species ratio changes, food chain disruptions, fisheries bycatches, habitat destruction or loss, our ocean life, something the entire planet depends on, is severely threatened and has been in peril with limited signs of recovery for over half a century now. It may be easy to say these are just birds or it's just one bird, it's not a big deal, but the reality is now, at such a severe point, just a few birds incidents adds up, especially when a species such as our threatened tufted puffins here at Haystack Rock can see a 20% decline in population over a single year. And when global biodiversity is in a rapid freefall, each of these individual impacts has severe consequences than they once did, much larger than they once did. All of our ecosystems are connected, and impact from one location can have a butterfly effect around the globe. Those effects are stronger for birds which sit at a higher trophic level and whose ranges are much more globally widespread. We have an opportunity here to try and get ahead of this. Instead of waiting for what happened to the 1,500 elegant terns in California who abandoned their nests after a drone crash to occur here in Oregon, we can prevent it from the start. And I encourage our committee to take the comments from the scientific community into deep consideration. Rules and decisions should always be data-driven and allowed to evolve with the current scientific and technological understandings. Conservation is hard, but recovery and reintroduction is much harder. Once a species and a habitat is gone from an area, it's likely it will be gone forever. A policy that is reactive rather than proactive has more severe consequences than an inverse does. We should do what we can at this point to not add any other stressors to a delicate environment such as our ocean shores. And when we are given the opportunity to preemptively act to protect rather than retroactively react, we should not be myopic and take it. I recognize that many drone users are responsible and do not want to harm the environment, and we see this all the time at our job, but harassment of animals does occur, and it's almost always unintentional, but intentions don't change the actual outcome. For recreational permits for a specific event and location, if a wildlife biologist expert is consulted with consideration to the specific type of aircraft and adequate education is provided to the operator, along with high fines and punishments for violations, then I believe that this could be a low impact approach. Otherwise, much of our... Sure. I just ask that we support our struggling wildlife. We keep peace, quiet, and harmony at our ocean shores. And sometimes I feel like I'm not so much as asking as pleading, because every day I see the dire situation that our wildlife who cannot speak for themselves are in. And one recreational hobby is not worth the risk of our entire ocean health. I plead to you that we must keep drones out of the ocean shores before we must retroactively move towards conservation only when it's once again much too little, much too late. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for being here, Kelly. Next up is Steve.
Thank you for providing us with the opportunity to testify tonight. My name is Steve Griffiths and I live in Lincoln City. There are many things that appeal to all of us about the Oregon coast: wide open beaches, forests, headlands, and rocky shorelines, and especially the wildlife. Lincoln County, my home county, provides significant habitat for large colonies of nesting seabirds, common murres at Cape Lookout, cormorants at Cape Foulweather, and a vibrant mix of species at Yaquina Head. The county is also home to western snowy plovers and black oyster catchers. Thousands of visitors come to Lincoln County each year to experience the beauty and wildness of our coastline and to observe migrating whales and nearshore seabirds. Some come to the coast simply to take a break and get away from it all. I myself enjoy going on long beach walks. I was doing so one day when I heard an odd sound, a whirring buzz. I looked around and saw no one. The buzz continued. Then I looked up and saw a drone hovering less than 10 feet over my head. I was not amused, even a little spooked. My sense of being alone on an isolated stretch of beach had been violated. My afternoon of getting away from it all spoiled. In view of the above, I recommend the following. To protect our wildlife and to protect the visitor experience, drones should be prohibited at all state parks and beaches unless otherwise indicated as allowable. Decisions about where drone use would be allowable should be based on the best available science. State parks should establish an independent working group to determine where drones would be allowable, selecting drone takeoff and landing areas that would minimize wildlife, cultural, and recreational impacts. State parks should include strong enforcement mechanisms in the final rules. Having specific sites where drone use is allowed would contribute to more effective enforcement. Lastly, I am concerned about how the Drone Rules Committee was formed. It's clear that not all stakeholders were invited to the table. Conservation groups were not initially invited and weren't able to join the discussion until the committee's second meeting. Is this the Oregon way? And there is no representation from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has a key role in managing natural areas along the Oregon coast, as well as regulatory management of seabirds. Thank you for your attention and for letting us testify this evening.
Thank you for being here. Next up is Paul.
Good evening. I'm Paul Engelmeyer. I manage land for Audubon Society south of Yachats. It's the 10 Mile Creek Sanctuary. And I'd like to really support Tim, Joe, Fran, Derek, Kelly, Steve. All of those presentations were excellent. I really hope that the agency listens to that. I'd like to add a little bit to that, a little bit of a pat on the back. I was fortunate enough to be at the right place at the right time with some of my seabird monitoring team that identified an issue, which was nets in the beach. And we worked with state parks to identify a way to reduce this ghost net that would have been trapping species in the near shore. It's just an example of stressors that are happening and are happening, have happened, and will continue to happen. We need to take a precautionary strategy. And the realization that this non-consumptive recreational use is incredibly high, which is great news, but that doesn't mean, and they bring in millions of dollars to the coast, which is great news. But the reality of it is that we need an educational strategy and outreach to raise the level of awareness and appreciation for what is on our beaches, in our estuaries, in our uplands, because these are visitors, just like the visitors that are coming from thousands of miles away on their migration, that are being put at risk with decisions about drones, drone use. So it isn't just, it is not only the nesting sites, but it's also stopover staging areas for the migration pattern in the Pacific Flyway. And you've got species that are coming 1,000 miles to feed on our beaches. And so those are also a piece of this strategy that needs to be acknowledged. The stressors are real. How many of these ES endangered species that could be impacted by the discussion policy direction right now? Murrelet are in the near shore, peregrine falcon feeding, osprey, eagles, oyster catchers, pelicans, and sea lions. All of these things are real, and a precautionary strategy needs to be developed. So I was incredibly surprised that the conservation representation was not at the table, nor even U.S. Fish and Wildlife. It is appalling from my perspective, because I've had to deal with many controversial issues in my past. So in any event, there's an opportunity to move forward. I support these policy directions of prohibit from rocky shore, snowy plover management areas, MRs, marine reserves, marine protected areas. I'm more than willing to give a talk to anybody at OPRD about those issues. These are conservation strategies that are related to statewide Goal 19, protecting marine biodiversity for current and future generations. And right now, how are we doing? And so the thousands of visitors are in awe of our landscape headlands, but they're on a learning curve. So an education and outreach effort, whether it's sneaker waves, dog on a leash, feeding birds in murrelet areas, the realization that state parks, 50% of our state parks have murrelet occupied designations. And the Crumb Clean campaign is an opportunity to engage with them. So I thank you for this opportunity.
Great. Thanks for being here, Paul. Next up is Lisa, if you want to unmute.
Thank you and good evening. I'm Lisa Hobbicker. I'm the education and the volunteer coordinator for the Haystack Rock Awareness Program. I'm also a U.S. Fish and Wildlife volunteer for the Haystack Rock Awareness Program. I have worked 20 years for HREP. I have seen firsthand increased visitation and environmental stressors take their toll on our nesting seabirds and our shorebird, the black oyster catcher. And now drones are becoming a stressor. Drones can be a valuable tool for the scientific community and for law enforcement. Most hobbyists are respectful and are considerate when it pertains to wildlife. Others, not so. 5 years ago, we would make contact with a pilot for disturbing wildlife maybe a couple times a year. And every single time, they were incredibly apologetic. Now, we're seeing wildlife disturbances by drones almost daily. This is such a huge increase. And others, and unfortunately, most of the drone pilots we are unable to locate because they are hiding in their hotel rooms or vacation rentals and operating their drones from the room. Flying a drone is a privilege and should be done so responsibly and with respect to humans and to wildlife. Having absolute clear policy and consequences would help. I'm absolutely not anti-drone, but I would like to see Haystack Rock, the Needles, and Marine Garden to be considered a no-fly zone year-round for the protection of seabirds, shorebirds, and the serenity of tide pooling without the drone of drones. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Lisa. Nora, you're up next.
Hi, my name's Nora Sherwood, and I'm here in Lincoln City. And I don't have a lot to add to all of the points that have been made about restricting drone usage in state parks. Just a few specific items that I would like to add. I was involved in a project where we were creating some educational materials with school children about wildlife disturbances, and it was specifically for snowy plovers. But what we learned in that project was that the adults who are sitting on eggs along the coastline, when they see some sort of shadow up above them, the parents will leave the eggs and fly away, or otherwise, hide themselves because they perceive that shadow as potentially being a predator. So what happens with the eggs is every time a drone flies over in the area, it's perceived as a threat, and the adults leave the eggs, and so the eggs get colder and colder and less viable. So that's one point that I want to make, is that it's just a question of protecting those nests. And in terms of an educational strategy, I really do think that a lot of drone users simply do not know that they are causing this problem. But it's pretty clear that enforcement is extremely difficult. Here in Lincoln City, there are so many things that happen on the beach that are not allowed, and there simply aren't the resources to enforce. Fireworks on the beach all through the summer, but especially on the 4th of July. It's a huge problem. Fishing in the Marine Reserve area off of the beach here happens all the time. Nobody's enforcing that. So it seems to me that it does need to be sort of black and white. You just can't have drones in state parks, because if there's this and there's that area and there's maybe here and not there, it's not going to be enforceable, and there's not the resources to enforce it. So I see that is a really big problem. And we do need to be backing off with recreational uses and allowing wildlife just a fighting chance. And I see the arm waving, and I said I was going to be quick, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to provide testimony tonight.
Thank you, Nora. Next up, we have Neil.
Good evening. This is Neil Holcomb. I live down here on Oregon's south coast, where virtually every place offshore is a bird colony, whether a seabird colony, a shorebird colony, or a nesting area for raptors. And I have personally seen drone disturbance here and agree that most people don't understand that their operation of a drone is disturbance. And so it is probably the most appropriate action to take would be to simply prohibit the operation of the drone in these sensitive areas without a special use permit. As a recreational hunter and fisherman, I'm used to obtaining a permit, and I'm also used to following the regulations regarding where I'm allowed to use that permit. I don't think that that's an onerous burden, and I would urge that the best science be evaluated and used in the decision-making process here. Thank you. That concludes my comments.
Great, thank you for being here, Neil. Next up, we have Angela.
Hi, thank you so much for giving me a few moments to share with you. My name is Angela Whitlock, and I live in Seaside, Oregon. I've been a North Coast resident for the past 23 years, and I'm testifying in support of prohibiting drone use unless permitted. I'm speaking to you this evening as a citizen, a concerned citizen, and we're going to talk a little bit about my experience on the beach. I spent a lot of time exploring our beaches, trails, and rocky habitats from Fort Stevens State Park down to Cape Falcon Marine Reserve. Like many local residents and visiting beachgoers, I find that it is essential to my health and well-being to get away from TV and telephone screens, to get out of traffic jams, and go outside and listen to the ocean waves, explore the tide pools, watch the seabirds, and stand in awe of a spectacular sunset. And it's a super big bummer when this is all disrupted by the loud mechanical whir of a drone. I can usually hear them before I can spot them. They are very loud. Visitation to our coast has gone way up in the past few years, and with it, so has drone use. It is my experience now that is more the norm for me to see and hear drones on my outings than to not. That's especially happened, I'd say, in the past 2-3 years, especially. I believe drones can be useful, and there are those who operate them responsibly, but I've witnessed so many instances where users have done harm intentionally or not. And as intrusive as I find drones to be, the wildlife experiences drones as a threat. I've witnessed nesting seabirds being flushed out of their nests, leaving their eggs and chicks exposed. I've witnessed a drone intentionally making pass after pass over the top of a flock of resting birds who are resting on the sand. And this drone was getting as many of them to frighten off as possible. Once I actually approached some drone users, probably inadvisably so, but I pointed out that there were some nesting birds very near to them, and to let them know, point out where they were, and ask them to please just operate the drone away from these birds. I thanked them for chatting. They thanked me for the info. And as I walked away, I got away just far enough, and the drone users buzzed the top of my head very intentionally before they took off really quickly. So I am requesting that our rocky habitats and beaches that are so important for human use and for the wildlife be protected from drones and become a drone-free zone. They should be left naturally as they are, without for us to experience and the wildlife to experience without intrusive technology. Thank you so much for giving me some time.
Thank you, Angela. Next up is Andrew. I apologize. Andrew, if you want to unmute. Andrew, if you want to unmute.
Do you have me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Drones disturb people and animals. Their value in nature to the natural world is myopic, minimal, and often selfish. First, let's talk about drones' effect on animals. Birds often view drones as predators. When they see drones, they flee. Last year in California, as been mentioned, a drone crash left thousands of elegant terns to abandon their nest. The frightened birds left behind somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 eggs. At home in Oregon, we're in the midst of some very disturbing trends of seabird colony decline. These declines have been taking place over decades for a variety of reasons, almost all related to human disturbance, and drones, introduced recently, growing in popularity and getting cheaper all the time, are adding an unnecessary stress to these at-risk populations. I'm gonna skip over some of the things that have been mentioned and just echo all the great conservation and science that has been mentioned. I want to look at a more personal, let's talk about people. On a personal note, I want to say that I feel like when drones are in my vicinity, my privacy is being invaded. I find a whizzing drone, whether in earshot or my sight lines, a distraction that takes me out of the present and short circuits my connection with the natural world. Once while on the beach here in Cannon Beach, my girlfriend was followed and presumably photographed by a drone and was unable to locate its pilot, who remained cloaked in anonymity, perhaps thousands of feet away. While the appreciation for the concerns of animals cannot be overstated, I'm surprised we haven't heard more people talk about the potential for violations of privacy, photographing or filming people or children in bathing suits on the beach. That's a major concern. And so is the protection of these vulnerable populations of animals. And the answer to these problems is as clear as it is simple. Ban drones from the coast. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Angela?
Yeah, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity. My name is Angela Benton, and I live in Cannon Beach. And this evening, what I'd like to say is I would encourage the committee to amend the draft ruling to prohibit the takeoff and landing of drones unless expressly permitted. And expressly permitted, what I'd like to see is that would be established by an independent working committee based on the best available science. I think this evening we've heard a lot of why this is so important, but just to reiterate, drone usage is increasing. I spend a lot of time on the beach. I have a view of the ocean out my window, and I regularly see drones flying overhead. Now, most of the time, these are not malicious or intentional disruptions, but as people try to get that perfect view of, you name the rock off the coast, be it Cannon Beach, Haystack Rock, or any of the sea stacks, these drones fly over vulnerable nesting birds, including the nests of black oyster catchers and tufted puffins. And you've heard a lot of black oyster catchers, but I want to spend a minute talking about tufted puffins. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey last summer documented only 550 remaining tufted puffins that are nesting throughout the whole coast of Oregon. Can we really afford to have even one of these nests disrupted by accidental encounter with a drone? Again, I don't believe that the drone users are malicious, but as was noted earlier, oftentimes animals view the drones as a predator, as an invasion, as something that they need to take care of. So even quiet drones and well-intentioned drone users can affect nesting birds. But let's just not talk about nesting birds. Let's also talk about foraging birds, migrating birds, and, in addition to nesting birds, these drones put additional stressors on these birds. The science on drone disruption of nesting birds is well documented. Again, the takeoff and landing of drones should only be allowed in areas where expressly permitted based on the best available science. And I want to stress this is consistent with OPRD's current regulations requiring special use permits when such uses can disturb the natural, cultural, scenic, and recreational resources. Disruption of birds is a natural resource. And as was just mentioned, I spent a lot of time on the coast, and I am troubled by with the onslaught of visitors that we get here on the coast. The number of drones that fly overhead has increased. And I feel like that impedes and affects my recreational experience as well as others. So again, I believe drones should only be allowed in areas where expressly permitted. Other states, including California, Colorado,
Angela,
Texas,
you're at 3 minutes if you want to conclude.
Thank you. They also banned the takeoff and landing of drones unless permitted, and they do that specifically because of the adverse impact on wildlife, and Oregon should follow their lead. And finally, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a policy of drone use being prohibited unless permitted. They manage 1,853 rocks, reefs, and islands off the coast of Oregon, and I think a change in policy to prohibit the takeoff and landing of drones unless permitted would make their job easier and be consistent with their policy. Thank you for your time this evening.
Great, thank you, Angela. And next up, we have Anne.
Hello, my name is Anne Velisis, and I'm president of the Kalmiopsis Audubon Society. Our group has more than 400 members on the South Coast who care about birds and wildlife and their habitat and cherish the opportunity to hike and enjoy and observe the beautiful natural environments of our coastal state parks and beaches, including birds and wildlife. I testified at last night's hearing, but I came back tonight because last night some drone users questioned that drones would have any impact on birds. So I just wanted to underscore that as an Audubon president, I can tell you, I have heard concern and anecdotes from many of our members about drones and birds, but there's also data. Several of our members participate in Oregon's Black Oyster Catcher Project, which last year documented a rate of over 3 drone disturbances per week at active nests, which are generally located on rocky areas, but often occur in relatively close proximity to beaches. Many speakers tonight have provided lots more examples and science and incidents, so I won't go through a lot of them, and we'll be providing written comments. But I just wanted to underscore again that our beloved Oregon state parks are popular destinations with increasing visitation, increasing conflicts and stresses. And so we really need for state parks to be proactive now about protecting the exceptional experience of visitors to our parks and on our coasts, and also minimizing wildlife disturbances into the future. I'm concerned that the currently proposed regulations that generally allow drone use everywhere, except for some few places where they will be restricted, is the wrong way to go. And so I strongly urge you to change this framework and recommend instead that all state parks and beaches be closed to drone takeoff and landing, except where they can be safely allowed and by special permit. State parks should convene an independent technical working group to determine if and where there are appropriate drone takeoff and landing areas that can minimize wildlife, recreational, and cultural impacts. I also want to echo concerns about how difficult it will be to enforce differential rules about drones, especially on the coast where we have lots of different state parks and and as many people have pointed out, the wildlife refuges right offshore with all of the bird colonies. Drone use is just emerging now and growing, but if you don't start with more of a science-based approach now and a more conservative, precautionary-based approach now, I am really concerned about what on earth we'll do in the future. So I hope you will please take these considerations into account. We all love our state parks and really want to be able to enjoy them into the future. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anne. Is there anyone else that I have not called on that would like to testify? And while you're looking at that, I will share my screen again with the links for providing written comments. Again, we are taking public comment through April 7th, and you can share comments on our website, in writing, or via email. And if there's no one that I missed, we want to thank you for taking your time this evening and sharing your comments with us. We will be preparing a report from the comments that were received and putting a link to the video for this evening's hearing on our website, along with all of the comments that are submitted. And that will be shared with the Parks and Recreation Commissioners. So thank you for being here this evening, and that concludes our public hearing. Thank you.